HIP70 passed yesterday by a sizable margin. It was the largest vote turnout in Helium's history, and the HNT weighted vote percentage was actually more in favor of voting against HIP70 than the straight vote counts by about 1.5%. This is certainly a massive step in the right direction for Helium, as increased speed, freed up dev time, and access to a larger crypto ecosystem are highlighted as some of the major advantages. However, I did vote against this HIP, almost entirely out of principle. I will break down first why I agree a move to an L1 had to happen and why I am ultimately glad this passed, but alternatively, why I voted against it. It is largely based on principle and some things Amir said at Helium House, New York City, while discussing HIP70 with one of the co-founders of Solana. Let's take a look at the details in today's video. What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another video here on the Crypto Compound channel. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope you guys are having a great day. Please hit that like and subscribe on the way in. It really helps support the channel. Today's video, we are going to be discussing HIP70, the benefits of it, the margins at which it was passed, and ultimately the reason why I had to vote against it. But first, quick temperature check here on the charts. As you can see, Helium is hovering around the $4.50 level here. I would consider this a decent position here. What we're going to be looking for is to make a higher low than this trough that we can see here. As long as we do that, we are in good shape. Coming below this trough here would be another break in the structure here. This could, as I mentioned in the last video, be the very beginning of the new trend here on the Helium chart. Please. If we look at the 4-hour, which I really don't like to do, we can see that we're fighting to stay above the 50 EMA here on the 4-hour chart, as you can see highlighted by that blue line. Being above this obviously would be great, but this chart, as far as we're concerned right now with this very macro view, this isn't really important. So we will try and stick to the daily for the next few weeks, but I know a lot of you guys do enjoy looking at the charts. But ultimately, nothing really exciting here until we start to test this 50 EMA here by that highlighted by that blue line on the daily chart. That is going to become very interesting. As we can see back here, we have failed to overtake it 2 or 3 times here in the recent past, back in late July to the beginning of August. So once we get back to this area, that is when things will start to get really interesting from a technical chart perspective. Now guys, if we jump over here to the HIP70 vote page on heliumvote.com, we can see the little blurb, and we can come down here and see that this passed by 81%. That is the HNT weighted percentage, and the amount of HNT that voted against it was 18.5%. Now, if you do the quick math here on the actual votes, the votes against HIP70 was actually about 17%. So if this was a strict one-to-one, wallet-to-wallet vote, this actually would have passed by a smaller margin. That is really interesting because a lot of people, if you look at the criticism around the voting process, always say that voting is useless because the whales drive the vote. However, it is really interesting because I do agree with that. That is just that is the reality of how this voting system works. But it is super interesting to see that in this case, that actually worked against passing this HIP, which is really interesting. Now, if we scroll up here, they did quickly highlight some of the advantages here, including more HNT available to sub-DAO rewards pools. I mean, it's a very small amount of HNT, but that is true. More consistent mining, more reliable data transfers, more utility for HNT and sub-DAO tokens, and more ecosystem support. All of that is true. And they juiced it up, if we remember, with an update to this HIP shortly after it was originally proposed, with a shorter cooldown period, a bonus on staking VHNT, and a small seed funding of SOL for 100 transactions on the Solana blockchain. Those were obviously welcomed, but those were added after the fact. Really interesting. However, this did pass. We are moving, and if we go over here to James, he was an author of previous HIPs. He's very involved in Helium, very smart guy, and this was one of the reasons why I was almost ready to vote in favor of HIP70. And his point was that an L1 is needed regardless of what it is. He mentions the tribalism in the crypto community, which is certainly true, and that sort of stuff really does bother me as well. His ultimate point here here was there's no point in arguing one L1 over another. Helium just needs to be directionally correct, which they are with Solana, he mentions, and free up resources to focus on building the Helium network. Ultimately, HIP70 must pass. Now, I agree almost entirely with what James is saying here. I totally 100% agree that Helium needs an L1, one, and two, freeing up the resources to focus on network building is probably the biggest benefit of moving to an L1. We'll see why in just a second. Amir actually mentions a percentage of the development work that goes to actually maintaining the Helium blockchain right now. So this is going to really catapult Helium into the future by freeing up all of that dev space. Now, as all of this was going on and the voting was open, we even saw other L1s come into the mix, including Algorand. The more I think about it, the more I feel like this might have just been a publicity stunt on their part. As you can see, some of their founders and co-founders were making all sorts of crazy tweets at Amir and at Helium and the Helium Foundation. They even went on to posting the formal letter that they sent to Tushar, the Helium Foundation, Scott Siegel, and ultimately Amir Helium, in which they criticized Helium for the way that they proposed HIP70 and said that they should consider Algorand as well as some other L1s. Now, there is a lot of truth to all of what he is saying here as well, but it was a little bit weird the way they came out and just started screaming when we've never heard of these people or Algorand being involved in Helium ever before. Now, guys, I'm going to play a clip here from Helium House where Amir does outlines what I believe to be the biggest benefits of moving to an L1, in this case it now being Solana, but this is Amir Helium on the benefits.
So separating all of that out into like its constituent parts, so that proof of coverage is its own thing, so that data transfer is its own thing, and that the L1 is its own thing, has always been something that we considered and wanted to work towards. And then once you sort of break apart the system like that, it becomes a question of like, well, why would you continue to operate your own L1? Like, you get none of the benefits of being part of a bigger ecosystem like the Solana one. You don't have any compatibility to things like DeFi and NFTs and like all of the interesting stuff going on across crypto. And it takes an enormous amount of our engineering resources. Like, we spend, I don't know, it's got to be like 70+% of our engineering time to date has been like firefighting, like what I would call problems with the L1.
So that is Amir outlining some of the advantages, which I believe to be the biggest advantages, in fact, of HIP70, which is great. Now, this was on the panel with a co-founder of Solana at Helium House just a few days ago. And then shortly after, Amir said this is what really turned me off, which is what really made me realize that I'm going to vote against this almost strictly out of principle. But here is what Amir said.
And actually, Anatoly was one of the very first people who was advocating for the model that is described in HIP70.
Now, that really left me with a bad taste in my mouth because Anatoly there is one of the co-founders of Solana, and Amir is actually saying that he was one of the people who proposed this sort of structure change to the Helium team. Now, my immediate thoughts was that this really is shining a light into how things are working behind the scenes. Of course, they proposed HIP70 and people go out and vote. However, HIP70 was not an open discussion about which L1s to go to. It was a proposal to go to Solana or not go to Solana. And this here by Amir saying that one of the co-founders of Solana was one of the people who actually proposed this type of structure and this type of model really gives me very little confidence that Solana actually may have been the best choice for an L1 after Helium claimed to have done all of their research. Now, the sad part of all of this is that, in fact, Solana might actually be the best choice of an L1 for Helium to go to. However, after hearing something like this and knowing about all of the funding partners that Solana and Helium share, it is impossible to believe that even if it is true, Helium never actually fully disclosed all of their research about different L1s and how deep they dived and the due diligence they did. So it is very hard for me to believe that this really is the best choice. However, I really do agree that we need an L1 and I'm ultimately happy we're going. But that is the point where, strictly out of principle, I was not going to vote in favor of this. And to go even further, later that night after Helium House, Amir did appear on Bloomberg and he said the following. And of course, he was questioned about HIP70 and moving to Solana, and this was his answer.
You've also considered switching Nova Labs to the Solana network, and given that we were just talking to the co-founder of Solana, where did you end up on that?
So the Helium network is governed by its users. So there's a community-driven process for proposing changes. There is a proposal in the community. It's called HIP70. It proposes to re-architect the way Helium works to separate the architecture to be a little bit simpler, to be a little bit faster. And as part of that, we're also proposing moving the blockchain function to the Solana network primarily because of exactly what Anatoly was describing.
So in his answer, he immediately refers to this as being community proposed, which technically it is, and it is then voted on by the community. However, he makes it sound like the community chose Solana rather than Solana being offered as the one L1 option and being able to vote to it or against it. So out of principle, I was really turned off by this and I voted against HIP70. Like I said, ultimately, I am happy that we are moving to an L1 and it is certainly needed and will certainly benefit the network as a whole. And I am still very excited and optimistic about the future of Helium. However, the delivery of this HIP and the interconnection of Helium and Solana and the tiptoeing around that relationship is really why I voted against it. Let me know your comments down below. Thank you guys so much for being here and watching until the end. I'm curious to know what you guys think, if you agree, disagree, voted for it, or against it. Let me know in the comments below. Please hit that like and subscribe if you have not already. But just like that, this video is over and I will see you next time.